Okay, so how many people here have Bitcoin? Fantastic. And how many people do not yet have Bitcoin? And the difference is the people too shy to raise their hand. Okay, great. The 4 or 5 people who raised their hand who said they don't yet have Bitcoin, remember the faces of the people who do have Bitcoin, and do not leave here tonight without getting them to give you some free Bitcoin. And if they won't, I will. The whole point of this is to help you install a wallet, receive a small amount of Bitcoin so you can do some transactions and try it out for yourselves. And it's always fun. The first time you experience a Bitcoin transaction will be memorable. All right. The topic of today's talk is proof of work and the monument of immutability. I want to talk specifically about immutability and what that means in this new era of digital currencies, what it means to have a digital system that is unchanging. Immutability is a tricky concept. First of all, because it doesn't really exist, right? Everything changes. There is no thing in nature that is forever unchangeable. The universe itself, the vacuum, particles, everything changes. Nothing is immutable. So immutability is really more of a philosophical idea, but we use it in practical terms. So what do we mean when we say immutable in practical terms? The way I like to think of it is, if you have a scale of something that's very easy to change, all the way to the hardest thing you can possibly find to change, the most unchangeable thing, the thing that is most difficult to change, immutability is that side of the scale, right? So for practical purposes, we'll define immutability in any sense to be the maximum of that scale of how hard it is to change something. And on January 3rd, 2009, that scale expanded significantly, and a new maximum was defined. A new maximum in terms of what it means to be immutable for a digital system. Nothing is as immutable as Bitcoin. So Bitcoin defines the end of that scale at the moment. And so it redefines the term immutable. Now that has some interesting implications, including that you can't call the things to the left of that immutable. You can't call them immutable-ish. You can't call them kinda immutable, right? Immutable-ish is like pregnant-ish, right? It only makes sense as the maximum value, not the maximum minus 1. So immutable, once it's redefined, the things below it can't be called immutable anymore. And so why is Bitcoin immutable? What gives the Bitcoin blockchain the characteristics of immutability? What is it that makes it unchangeable? And the first answer that most people go for is the blockchain. The blockchain makes Bitcoin immutable because every block depends on its predecessor, creating an unbreakable chain back to the genesis block, and therefore, if you change something, it would be noticed, therefore it's unchangeable. And that is the wrong answer. Because it's not really the blockchain that gives Bitcoin its immutability. And that's a really important nuance to understand. The blockchain makes sure that you can't change something without anyone noticing. And in security, we call that tamper evident, meaning that if you change it, it is evident. You cannot tamper it without evidence of your tampering. Tamper evident. But there's a higher standard in security, what we call tamper proof. And tamper proof is something that cannot be tampered with. Not just will be visible if it's tampered with, but cannot be tampered with, immutable. And the characteristic that gives Bitcoin its tamper-proof capability is not the blockchain, it's proof of work. Proof of work is what makes Bitcoin fundamentally immutable. And that is a really important concept to understand because a lot of people are throwing around words like blockchain and claiming that these things are immutable even though they don't have a proof of work consensus algorithm or any kind of consensus algorithm that gives them immutability. At best, they offer tamper evidence, meaning someone will notice, but they are not unchangeable. This distinction is going to become historically important. Now, you may think historically important, that's a pretty heavy term. Why is it going to be historically important? Because if Bitcoin continues to work the way it's working today, we are introducing a new concept, which is a form of digital history that is forever. And if that history lasts 10 years, that's impressive. If it lasts 100, that's astonishing. If it lasts 1,000 years, it becomes an enduring monument of immutability, an edifice of immutability, a system of forever history, unshakable history. And that is truly a monument of our civilization. And we have to consider the possibility that that will happen. I use the word monument, and I want to expand a tiny bit on that and talk about proof of work. Proof of work was not invented by Satoshi Nakamoto. You can see evidence of proof of work systems throughout human civilization. There is some big pointy proof of work in Cairo. The pyramids. There is some big stone proof of work in Paris, the Cathedral of Notre Dame. In fact, proof of work is something that our civilization does quite often. Let's think about that for a second. The pyramids serve two purposes. The minor purpose is as a religious artifact and tomb for the king. But the even more interesting purpose is a declaration to every civilization and every human that sees it. Behold, this is the measure of the Egyptian civilization. This is what we can build. This is proof of work. You cannot build this on the cheap. You cannot build this in a civilization that doesn't have abundant resources. You cannot build this unless you can feed 20,000 people to not do anything but this. You cannot build this unless you can guard it with soldiers. You cannot build this unless you commit resources for decades or centuries. This cannot be built cheap. And the pyramids stand today as a testament of proof of work for the Egyptian civilization. And anyone, without even understanding what this thing is, riding up in the desert on a camel, going over that hill, and seeing a stone monument that's a few hundred feet in the air, looks at that and goes, wow. And wow is an expression of believing the proof of work, right? Because they immediately and intuitively understand something great built that, and there is no cheap way to do it. The Cathedral of Notre Dame is the same thing. Marshalling thousands of stonemasons over hundreds of years to build a monument to the church, a monument of religion that made people stand in such awe that they could only even give it divine origin. They could but believe that only a religious order could do something like that. It says, behold the church, what we can do. That kind of open expenditure of resources to make a point is proof of work. And we see this again and again in civilization. But until now, we've only seen it in local environments for a specific country, organization, or civilization. Bitcoin is the first planetary scale, digital monument of proof of work. And to those who come later, we will be able to say, behold, this monument of immutability built over decades. Marvel at its function as well as its elegance, because it has function. Unlike the pyramids and the cathedrals, it serves a purpose, a practical purpose. And that practical purpose is to become a record of history forever, to become the definitive and authoritative source that cannot be modified, the record of truth that cannot lie. And once a transaction is embedded into the blockchain, the Bitcoin blockchain, and secured by proof of work, it becomes incredibly difficult to change. This is a thing that most people don't understand. So let's break it down a tiny bit and look at some of the technicals behind it. But Andreas, what if 51% of the miners decide to change it? What if there's a consensus attack? What if a well-funded government invests heavily in hashing equipment in order to go back and change the blockchain? So one of the interesting things you have to understand is the difference between changing the past and changing the future. The consensus algorithm as it is determines the future of the blockchain. If you have a majority of the hashing power on the Bitcoin blockchain, you can decide what gets recorded in the future. But you can't so easily change the past. And the reason you can't change the past is because every node out there is going to still validate every block and is going to demand proof of work. That block still has to carry proof of work. And there is only one way that proof of work can be generated. You have to commit energy resources to a particular block. When you read all of these articles in the media, they say about how wasteful Bitcoin is because Bitcoin is created by burning energy. They are completely missing the point. Mining doesn't work to create Bitcoin. That is not the purpose of mining. Mining is not used to create Bitcoin. That is a side effect. And the way I can prove to you it's a side effect is that one day there will be no Bitcoin, no new Bitcoin. Guess what? There will still be mining. Even after the last Satoshi is mined, mining continues. It must continue because its purpose is not to create Bitcoin. Its purpose is to provide security. Its purpose is to provide validation of all of the transactions and blocks according to the consensus rules. That is the purpose of mining, and generating Bitcoin is the side effect that serves as the mechanism of reward that creates game theory incentives to make sure that the validation is done right. Once you understand that and you realize what we're paying for is security, it changes the perspective slightly, but it's much deeper than that.